infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, I just finished reading this very, very important book, particularly in this day and age. It's called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism: My Journey as a Vaccine Scientist, Pediatrician, and Autism Dad. So joining me now to discuss it is the author, Peter Hotez, MD, PhD. Dr. Hotez, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Well, I think the best way to lay out this topic is we should start out with an introduction of you. So who is Peter Hotez professionally and personally?
Well, thanks for the question. So I'm a vaccine scientist. I'm an MD, PhD laboratory investigator who works at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital. There we have created a school of tropical medicine, but also I help lead a big center devoted to developing vaccines for poverty-related neglected diseases, neglected tropical diseases, and I'm also trained as a pediatrician. But the other piece to this is I'm a father of four adults, including 2 boys, 2 girls, and my youngest daughter, Rachel, who's 26, has autism and a lot of associated intellectual disabilities. So that put me in a very interesting position, being both a vaccine scientist and a parent of an adult daughter with autism and intellectual disabilities. And I felt I was in a position to really begin standing up to an anti-vaccine lobby that alleges that vaccines cause autism and other terrible things.
Yeah. So what exactly is autism?
So autism is first of all, let me just say the other big driver for my writing the book was the fact that for the first time we're starting to see the anti-vaccine movement have an impact on public health. As we're speaking, we're in the middle of a terrible measles outbreak in Washington State that may move into Oregon. We've had them in New York and New Jersey. The Centers for Disease Control in the U.S. estimates that we have more than 100,000 fully unvaccinated kids, and we've found millions more who are partially vaccinated, and lots of pediatric flu deaths this last flu season from unvaccinated kids. So the point is the anti-vaccine movement is winning these Pyrrhic victories that's affecting the health of children. So that was a big driver for writing the book. Autism refers to a broad range of conditions which are characterized by challenges with social skills and repetitive behaviors and speech and nonverbal communication, but it's really a spectrum of conditions which can also include seizures and sleep disturbances and gastrointestinal disorders, and it's estimated that about 1 in 60 children have autism, but those numbers are probably going to go up because we're getting better at diagnosing girls and women on the autism spectrum. We used to say it was 10 to 1 boys to girls, and now we realize, like my daughter Rachel, that the percentage is actually more closer to 1 to 1. It's just that girls on the autism spectrum have the ability to mask a lot of their symptoms or conditions, or camouflage them. They're more socially adaptive. They are more verbal, but they have very high rates of comorbidities like obsessive compulsive disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Even some of the girls and women with eating disorders are in fact on the autism spectrum. So I think a major piece to this that not many people realize is that for Rachel and others, so many individuals on the autism spectrum, it's not the autism itself in many cases, but that there's fellow travelers, and a number of people on the autism spectrum have comorbidities, including intellectual disabilities like Rachel has.
Yeah. Now, as you already mentioned, you and your wife, Anne, have several children, and Rachel, of course, is the feature of this particular book. Can you talk a little bit about Rachel and your experiences with an autistic child and her diagnosis?
Sure. So Rachel was our third, and she was born in the early 1990s and came to medical attention around 18, 19 months of age, which is a classic period when a lot of kids on the autism spectrum come to medical attention. But we had noticed something early on, even after she was born, that she wasn't as huggy as the other kids, or as my wife Ann says, she didn't mold to Ann like the other kids did. So we had some prior experiences with kids who didn't have autism to know that there was something different here. And she came to medical attention at 18, 19 months of age, ultimately was diagnosed with what was then called pervasive developmental disorder, PDD, which was the term used for autism at that time, when she was seen at the Yale Child Study Center, which is a world center of excellence for autism. And at that time, I was an assistant professor at Yale, trying to get a lab started in developing vaccines for neglected diseases. So this was came as a bit of a shock. And in the book I kind of go through Rachel's life history, progressing to when she was a very little girl to all the way through adolescence, and now as a young adult woman on the autism spectrum. So it's a unique book in the sense that it's both it's a science book that goes into details explaining the evidence showing there's no link between vaccines and autism, what autism is, and the evidence showing that these developmental processes begin in early fetal development well before kids ever see vaccines, and that's important because it explains not only the evidence there's no link between vaccines and autism, as the anti-vaxxers allege, but there's not even any plausibility. Mm-hmm. And then it goes into a very personal story for my wife and I, and Rachel, and it goes into some detail about Rachel's life. So Rachel is an active part of the book. She's actually quite excited to be part of it because she feels like she's making a contribution to science in a sense. So in that way, it's a unique type of book. I haven't seen one quite like it that interweaves the science with such a personal story.
Yeah, and like I said in the intro, this is a really, really important book in this day and age. Dr. Hotez, several years after she was born, the Wakefield study was published. So here you are with an autistic child, and this paper is published in a major scientific journal that tried to link autism to the MMR vaccine. What were your thoughts in 1998?
So by that time, Rachel was 6 years old, and I had seen the paper. And when I saw it, and what it claimed was that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, which is a live virus vaccine, mostly the measles component, had the ability to somehow replicate in the gastrointestinal tract and then lead to autism. Didn't make any sense to me because, we had watched Rachel, and it was clear that her behaviors and her social skills or repetitive behaviors or speech could not possibly be caused by a vaccine, that this reflected deep anatomical changes in the brain, which can only be explained by genetics. And in fact, that's been borne out. A recent paper put up in bioRxiv by a huge group of scientists led by the Harvard Broad Institute at Harvard and MIT finds at least 99 genes involved in fetal brain development leading to autism, including those involved in the neuronal cytoskeleton. And that's relevant because one of the things we've done now with Rachel is whole exome sequencing, and we've now identified a gene that bears resemblance to the ones that the Harvard Broad Institute found.
Well, vaccines, clearly a huge public health success, if not the greatest. As a scientist, can you give us your thoughts on that statement I just said?
Well, vaccines are probably the greatest invention of humankind in terms of saving lives. I mean, the first evidence of that is what happened with smallpox. Smallpox was the killed an estimated 300 million people, and during the 20th century, more people died of smallpox than all world wars combined. And now it's a disease that's been consigned to history because of a large vaccination campaign that began in the 60s and wrapped up in the late 70s. It's the first disease we've ever eradicated. It shows you the power of using a vaccine. Mm-hmm. And since then, through the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, when they created the Gavi Alliance, the Global Alliance of Vaccines and Immunization, we've now expanded that coverage first through what's called EPI, the Expanded Program in Immunization, and now through Gavi, to start reaching most of the world's children with vaccines for their vaccine-preventable diseases. And the result is significant declines in measles deaths. So measles in the late 70s killed 2 million children annually. By the year 2000, at the start of Gavi, 500,000 children died, and now it's around 100,000. So still a lot of kids dying of measles, but huge gains nonetheless. And similar stories for whooping cough and others. And so the point being, these are extraordinary life-saving technologies and have such an amazing track record. My worry now is that with the start of Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunization, we've also had a sinister force in play, which is this rise of an anti-vaccine movement. And they've now become very powerful and well organized. So I think in the beginning, after the Wakefield paper, the anti-vaccine movement started. It was fragmented. It was considered a cult or a fringe group, and nobody paid much attention to it, including the Centers for Disease Control. But things have changed, and now, by some estimates, there are almost 500 anti-vaccine websites that are out there, all amplified on social media, on Facebook and other social media outlets. And now in the U.S. we have political action committees that are actually raising money for candidates to run on an anti-vaccine platform. And the consequences are dire. As we've indicated, it's now affecting public health. I've mentioned what's happened in the U.S. now, 100,000 fully unvaccinated kids, millions more that are partially vaccinated, measles outbreaks in at least 4 states, Washington and Oregon and New York and New Jersey, deaths from pediatric flu because kids weren't vaccinated. And then across the Atlantic, we now have the estimates from the World Health Organization are that we had 60,000 measles cases in Europe last year in 2018, including dozens of deaths. So all of our public health gains, at least in the U.S. and Europe, are starting to unravel. Mm-hmm. And my worry is this is going to extend internationally into Africa, Asia, and Latin America as well.
Well, you do dedicate some chapters to some of the research, and the link between autism and vaccines has been essentially disproven over and over by study after study, right?
Well, yeah, and what's interesting is how one of the things I talk about in the book is what the anti-vaccine lobby does is to keep moving the goalposts. So it started out alleging it was the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and then that was disproven in large epidemiologic studies involving hundreds of thousands of children that were published in a very prestigious journal showing that kids who get the MMR vaccine are no more likely to get autism than kids who don't get vaccinated, as well as the fact that kids who are autistic have no more likelihood of getting the MMR than kids who are not autistic, so it worked both ways. But then what happened was, as that was being debunked, the anti-vaccine lobby alleged, no, it was not the MMR vaccine we meant, it was the thimerosal preservative that used to be in vaccines. And thimerosal was removed and autism rates did not go down. And again, large epidemiologic studies showed no link, as we would expect, because autism begins prenatally. But then the anti-vaccine lobby said, no, it's not thimerosal, we're spacing vaccines too close together. Then it shifted again to alum adjuvants in vaccines, aluminum. Mm-hmm. So you play this kind of game of what I call vaccine whack-a-mole, where you knock one down, another one pops up. But it's all phony. It's all garbage, and now we know it's garbage because we can see when autism begins, how autism begins prenatally.
You kind of touched on the research that's out there concerning autism. Dr. Hotez, what do we actually know scientifically about the cause of autism? What can we say definitively today?
What we can say definitively is that we have at least 99 genes that are involved in the control of prenatal development. So what we can see is that the changes in the brains of kids with autism are happening by first or second trimester of pregnancy, well before kids ever see vaccines. And this sets up a series of developmental pathways where oftentimes when a child is first born, you really don't notice any differences in behavior compared to non-autistic versus autistic kids. But then by 18 months, usually you have the full clinical expression of autism. And we can now actually, there's some great work done by the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill Autism Center that shows that clinical expression of autism at 18 months coincides with a big expansion in the volume of the brain, and this is seen on serial MRI, serial magnetic resonance imaging. And that's important to note because, parents will often say that my child was perfectly normal up until they were vaccinated around 15 or 18 months of age, then became autistic. Well, now you can show that those changes in the brain on MRI are actually apparent at 6 months of age, to the point where you can now determine with 90% accuracy, according to them, which kids are going to develop the autism spectrum, and now we can bring it back prenatally. And that's important information I provide in the book, because one of the things the anti-vaccine people don't do and put it up on the anti-vaxxer website or tell stories of parents whose child was, quote, vaccine injured, and then all of a sudden became autistic. We know that's simply not possible, but that's just the natural history of autism, that you get the full clinical expression around 18 months of age.
Now, unfortunately, despite all this research and much of it you describe in the book, Wakefield's 1998 paper still permeates, and not just here, but globally, as you mentioned. And the anti-vaccine movement is really big and powerful. And I have to say, it wasn't that long ago that it was Paul Offit that had the target on his back all the time with the attacks from them. But you seem to be right up there with them now. Dr. Hotez, can you share your battles with this movement?
Yeah, I think there was some journalist wrote that I was the heir apparent to Paul Offit, to which they interviewed Paul about it, and he said that's great. It's really tough, because the anti-vaccine lobby sees me as a threat because I can articulate why vaccines don't cause autism and some of the discussion that we've had. So what they try to do is one of the major approaches they take is to discredit me, and they do it by saying that I'm a shill for industry, that I'm getting all this money from the major pharmaceutical companies, which we don't take any money from the pharmaceutical companies. But my favorite one is they say I'm secretly making millions of dollars from our vaccines for schistosomiasis and Chagas disease and leishmaniasis. Mm-hmm. These are all poverty-related diseases. I'll never make a penny. My wife Ann says, if only, we could make that kind of money. But that's just not the case. I'll never make a penny on these vaccines. And then they assert other things. One of the more interesting ones is they call me the boy who cried wolf because I keep on telling people about the dangers of measles, and they assert it's a benign illness, ignoring the fact that it was the single leading killer of children in the world before we started widespread vaccinations. But now it's coming back. In fact, they even circulate there's even a kid's book out there that you can find on Amazon called Melanie's Marvelous Measles, and it's a children's book, written as a children's book, explaining why measles is a good thing to get and why it strengthens the immune system. It's just horrible what's being put out there.
So, Dr. Hotez, how can this mindset be reversed?
Well, what I've found is if you talk to vaccine hesitant, let's use the phrase of the day, vaccine hesitant parents, and talk to their pediatricians, what I find is the majority are not really deeply dug in. You know, they've read something on one of the phony misinformation websites, or they've heard something from a friend or a relative. But you can talk parents off the ledge and explain to them, as we're discussing now, the evidence showing there's no link between vaccines and autism, and they're good with it. Then there's another 10 to 20% of parents who are deeply dug in and start believing some of the conspiracy theories that the anti-vaccine people put out there, saying that Centers for Disease Control is secretly in pharma's pocket and all this kind of stuff. And the fact that you're trying to talk them out of it means you must be part of the conspiracy yourself. So that's a tough one. So I'd say the majority of parents you can have a discussion with and get them to vaccinate their child. And then there's another 10 to 15% are totally dug in. But, you know, the problem is in a busy pediatric practice, you know, where, you know, docs and nurse practitioners need to turn over patients every 20 minutes or so in order to ensure that their practice is financially solvent. That's a lot of time to spend, so that becomes in itself a burden. I think the other problem that I'm seeing right now is the anti-vaccine lobby is so well organized, so adept at its use of the internet and its 500 websites and social media and now political action committees, but we do not have a commensurate level of advocacy on the pro-vaccine side. We just don't hear a lot from our federal agencies about the importance of vaccinating your child and explaining why there's no link to autism or other things the anti-vaxxers allege. So that what happens in this country is that the defense of vaccines kind of falls to a handful of academics, you know, like myself or Paul, as you mentioned, or Dory Reese, who's a professor at the University of California, a law professor, and David Gorski out in Wayne State, and that's not adequate, right? We need a more robust response than that, and I'm hoping that these measles outbreaks in the early part of 2019 might cause a sea change and get people to really speak out on behalf of vaccines.
Well, you mentioned that Rachel is an adult now. How is she doing?
Well, she's, it's two steps forward, one step back with Rachel. She, has a lot of severe behavior issues, but the book ends on a positive note that Goodwill Industries really helped her out a lot and helped us out, and now she works 2 hours a day at Goodwill in our neighborhood. She can walk there. She's involved in sorting clothes and has a lot of self-esteem over having that job and getting a paycheck. So even though it's modest, for us it's a big step forward. We do worry about her being out there in the community, but that's Rachel. It's really important for her to interact. Mm-hmm. What we do worry about is what happens when we're gone, because there's not much of a safety net out there for adults on the autism spectrum, and that's where we need to shift the dialogue. We need to talk about autism from the sense of what are we doing for job counseling and job placements? What are we doing about helping them lead independent lives and providing adequate social services? Instead, the anti-vaxxers tend to suck all the oxygen out of the room talking about these phony vaccine arguments. And so in that sense, they're very destructive.
Yeah. Any final thoughts? Vaccines, your book, Rachel, autism, anything?
Well, I'm hoping the book, which again was written in response to the public health crisis that we're in right now, will start to turn things around as much as a book can. But the book, I think, will hopefully be an important first step on the road towards countering this very aggressive and phony anti-vaccine lobby.
Again, the book is Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism by Dr. Peter Hotez, and I'll link to it when I publish the audio on the website if you want to check it out and buy it. I definitely encourage it. It's really, really good. And I want to thank you, Dr. Peter Hotez, for writing this book and sharing your thoughts today, and God bless you and your family, sir.
Thank you so much. It was very kind of you, and I really appreciate you giving attention to this issue in the book.
You bet. Thanks, sir.